Okay, hello, welcome back after our short-ish kind of coffee break. As you remember, this morning we started out with variation, and I tried to place construction grammar into the kind of construction grammar that I think is important, into a grander approach to cognitive social linguistics. And we looked at variation with respect to to-do deletion, and then moved on to the effect of classical processing factors, domain general cognitive processes on the shape of the mental network. And in particular with the dative alternation, I already sort of touched upon Singaporean English and Indian English as new varieties. And that's sort of also part of my background. As Eleanor mentioned, I did my PhD in Regensburg with Edgar Schneider a couple of years back. So back in the distant past. And obviously, Edgar Schneider was working on the dynamic model as a uniform model to account for the process by which different types of Englishes evolve and why certain types of new Englishes have got similarities, whereas they are different from others. And as I said at the time, I was already working also in construction grammar, and I always wanted to bring the two together. And very recently, there was one study that I did where I was able to do it. It's a first pilot project. There needs to be a lot more work on it, but I think it's a fruitful enterprise, and it should sort of help support the dynamic model and also show that construction grammar can be used in the study of new Englishes and embedding it in a model that is already used there, the dynamic model. So I'm going to talk a bit about the dynamic model because I'm not sure how well all members of the audience know it. Construction grammar, I'm just going to focus on the revision of one or two terms which are going to be relevant. There's one, I'm looking in particular at comparative correlatives because I've worked on those for the last couple of years. I will show a corpus study that I did to sort of follow up the hypothesis that I had and show you the sort of constructionist questions that I asked of the data. And then I will sort of summarize and put it into a grounded perspective where I think usage-based construction grammar can be implemented in the dynamic model. It's pretty standard. English is a global language. We know that it's spoken in Australia, New Zealand, Kenyan Parliament. It can be the first language of Singaporean children. It's the lingua franca of Europe. It's the international language of pop, hip-hop, and so on. It's all over the place, but we also acknowledge the great differences between those varieties. And the dynamic model by Edgar Schneider tries to account for this. Because if you remember, one of the classic models in variation studies in New Englishes is Cuttrew's three circles model, where he said there are inner circle varieties, first language varieties, for example, British American English, but also Australian, New Zealand English. And then you've got outer circle varieties, second language varieties. English as a second language in Kenya, Nigeria, Cameroon, Singapore, and so on. And finally, an expanding circle where English would only be a foreign language taught at school, as I would assume you and I learned it at school as a foreign language. Now, the three circles model was important because at the time it sort of, also for ideological reasons, because it focused on the fact that second language varieties do not necessarily always have to just refer to British or American English as a reference point, but that we should treat Kenyan English and Nigerian English as varieties in their own right, and not always say how are they different, how are they wrong compared to British English, but that we need to identify them as valid linguistic varieties in the local context because people grow up speaking these languages in certain formal domains and for certain purposes. But it's a static kind of view, okay? It's at one point in time, you classify these as inner, outer, or expanding circles, and it sort of ignores the dynamic aspect, and it also is problematic for certain countries like, think South Africa, okay? If you look at the complexity of South Africa, then you've obviously got former expats, descendants of British settlers, and for them, English is their first language, so we would say South African English is an inner circle variety. But of course, we also know that there are many black and colored speakers there who speak English as a second language. English is the medium of instruction in secondary schools. It's still sort of your passport to economic success. It plays a huge role from a social linguistic point of view, from a sociology of language point of view. And for them, black South African English, I'm using the terms that are used in the handbook. They're not meant derogatory, but these are the standard kind of terms that are used for those varieties. So you've got black South African English, which is a second language variety, and you've got white South African, which is English, which is a first language variety, okay? So the circle approach doesn't work, because in a way you're going to say South Africa as a country, and it was associated with countries, is both an inner circle and an outer circle variety. And of course, when we look more closely at the different types of black South African English, the situation is even more complex. Some speakers will be completely fluent, they will use English as their first language, and some might not. And in order to account for that, because it always sort of relies on the historical context, how these varieties evolved, Edgar Schneider took a diachronic view in which he looked at, okay, how did the various varieties arise? And in particular, he sort of separated two strands, which, depending on the specific country, interacted to different degrees. And that's the settlers and the indigenous people. So we know that the spread of English around the world started with the colonial period. So during the colonial times, from the 16th, 17th century onward, Britain covered, like almost a quarter of the globe. And this is how these varieties spread. And in all of these, if we think about it, of course, there must have been native speakers of English going there, but the situation was different in many of the contexts. Sometimes only a handful went there and left pretty easily, pretty soon afterwards. In others, a lot of them stayed for longer, like in Australia. And this, of course, will make a difference. And the interaction, how a specific local variety of Englishes evolves in a country, depends on the interaction of the settlers as well as the indigenous strand. There is like a little circle going on for all of these, because Edgar looks at 4 different things at each of these stages. But he also has a kind of step-by-step model where he says some things follow in a kind of way. So the first phase would always be foundation, when English is taken to a new place. Okay? And you've got a certain number of native speakers in this new place, but they would still perceive of themselves as British. Okay? They're there on a short-term basis, there's nothing special about that, and then you get limited contact with the indigenous people, usually trade and missionaries, that kind of thing. The next stage, however, is exonormative stabilization. That's called thus because now they realize that they're sort of there for longer, and they got the idea of a British identity plus something. They're not just British people, but they're British people with the experience of having lived in Africa and in Asia. And their interactions with the local people get more intense. Then, this is sort of in the middle, there comes a phase, and that's the most important one for New Englishes, because in all of these we talk about colonization, especially 18th, 19th century, the last colonies to be added to the empire, probably Kenya, 1920-ish or so. But then we know that the empire sort of obviously fell apart. Right? After the Second World War, all of these countries, starting with India, and then many of the African and Asian ones, became independent. And this, at this stage, this event X, as Edgar calls it, is crucial because it needs people to reassess their identity. Okay? And he always looks at this from 2 sides, and the people in the settler strand need to re-establish their identity, because if they stay in the country, they're no longer British citizens, okay? Because then they are citizens of Kenya, or of South Africa, or of Singapore. And that's an important step. You are no longer a British citizen, now you've got to redefine yourself as a Kenyan citizen, or as a South African one. And for the indigenous people, obviously, now the Brits would have been gone. One could have almost expected that they also get rid of the colonial language in many of these situations. I assume that most of you know about the colonial history, but I mean, intuitively we would assume there are people oppressing you, they are gone, you get rid of their language. But as we all know, in these second language variety situations, it was much more complex in that the Brits had come and the nations that we talk about, something like Kenya or South Africa, didn't exist before the colonial period. There were native tribes spread all over Africa, but there were no national boundaries. And really only at the end of the 19th century, 1870-ish, I think, at the Berlin Conference, did the European powers separate their dominions on the African continent. And if you look at an African map today, you will notice that many of the boundaries are still very sharp, right? You look at South America, and they've got little edges and something, and it's sort of blurred, and you can see how it's a natural growing country, where sometimes, Brazil might be pushing into one of the boundary and one of the adjacent countries. But in Africa, it was really something that was done by the Europeans on a map. They went with a rule and went like, you can have this, I'm going to have that. Now, once they are gone, what we get is countries like, I'm going to take Kenya as an example because I worked extensively on that. You get a country like Kenya that didn't exist, that now comprises many different tribes who speak many different indigenous languages, many of which are not mutually intelligible. It's not like they could communicate using their local languages. And in the case of Kenya, you've got an ethnic setup where the largest group of people, Kikuyu, only make up less than 30% of the population. You don't have a clear majority. Okay? So you've got large groups from different language backgrounds, and they've got to agree on a language with which to run the country. Okay? Because they're now a country and they want to become independent. But really, they might have a lingua franca like Swahili, but English is already in place because the Brits came there and they introduced a legal system, they introduced a political system, they introduced an admin system. Okay? So you've got a running system that draws on English. In Kenya, there was, at the start, an attempt really to get rid of English, but because of the fact that, first of all, you've got a running political system in a specific language, and the laws and everything, you would have to translate that into a local language, and the fact that there's no single local language that could be expected to be chosen because of the competition. If you chose Kikuyu, then the Kimero would be angry, and the Dulu would be angry, that kind of thing. So you can't just pick one of the local ones, right? So English, because of its inter-ethnic communication value, also sort of remained in place. But it requires you to think about being an independent nation and having this English at your disposal and making it your own English. So this is a transitory period where linguistically we also see that more extensive contact between the former expats and the indigenous people, because now they really understand that they're in one country now together, and the British expats are no longer British citizens, and the Kenyans are no longer sort of a colonial population. They need to get along. They need to find a way to coexist. That didn't always run smoothly, but it means that you've got to reassess who you are, and your interactions are going to increase. Okay. Then in this fourth stage, endonormative stabilization, what you usually get is the crystallization. If they stay together for a longer period of time, there is more contact, and New Zealand English for a long time was seen as a situation there. So that people sort of move towards a new variety of English, which is fairly homogeneous. Okay? Because after this event X, you've got to get along, you interact more, and there seems to emerge a common type of variety. And the last stage is differentiation. That's Australia nowadays, and the US, that's pretty clear, where you then, after this stage where a new variety has emerged, you get social differentiation. Okay? Then you get heterogeneity again. Social groups replace the former ethnic groups. Then it's just important which social class, education, and so on you've got. For all of these stages, despite that I've collapsed all of these, it's important, as Edgar says, to look at four things which depend on each other and which sort of, like a causal chain, affect each other. So you can look at the political historical situation. For the foundation phase, when did the colony start? Who went there? What was the political status of this colony? Then you're going to have identity, because that's a very important point. He also talks about the social identity and the linguistic identity of the indigenous and the settlers for each of these stages. Because remember, at the start, these are just British people out and about, basically, and then gradually they got to come to the conclusion, oh, I'm no longer British, which means I've got to sort of re-identify myself, realign myself with a new identity. I'm partly Kenyan, but I've got this kind of expat background, so that's a continuing process. These also affect the social linguistic conditions, because your identity is also going to mean how you interact with between settlers and indigenous people and other settlers, and it hugely affects sort of social linguistic setup. And finally, linguistic developments at each of these stages, because the more the contact, the more effects you're going to find. For example, with transfer from the local languages, that's going to be more extensive. If you've come to stage 3 after event X, you're now an independent country, you've got to get along, settlers and indigenous people get in more contact, which means there can also be more transfer from the first languages. At the same time, and we will talk about different settlement types, because input frequency also with respect to people who go there is important. If it's a very large-scale settlement, like in the US or in Australia or in New Zealand, lots of settlers going there, taking over, and the ethnic minority then just having to adopt. And very often you get language shift away from Maori or one of the Native American Indian languages to American or Australian or New Zealand English as the first language. Okay, which implies a crucial, significant identity rewriting on the parts of the indigenous population. Okay. I will look at different settlement types in a second, but interestingly, and that's sort of what got me hooked on the dynamic model, and I thought construction grammar should have something to say about this, was this quote from Ecker when he describes the model. He says the dynamic model assumes that innovations and distinct structural properties of post-colonial Englishes are frequently positioned at the interface between lexis and grammar. Certain words, but not others, of the same word class prefer certain grammatical rules or patterns. The patterns as such are not new, nor are the words, but what is novel is the habitual association between them in specific varieties. Okay? And remember, the crucial claim of construction grammar was, of course, that there is no difference between lexicon and syntax. Okay, we get all of that should be constructions, but it's particularly that Edgar put it that way, that the interface between lexis and grammar, that he noticed that there is a sort of phenomena which in a classical model would be sort of in between, and from a construction grammar point of view would just be part of the Klein of schematicity, and that these become innovative and new in the new varieties. So I thought construction grammar should add something to that, because the ones on the Klein between lexis and grammar should be exactly what we should be good at. Ecker gives the following examples where things sort of start as new and what he considers lexicon syntax interface. Sometimes it's word formation, rice eating ceremony, Bula smile, a welcome smile in Fiji English. Preposition particle selection, so resemble to instead of resemble. You resemble someone in standard British English, but the complementation pattern, complementation with respect to lexis, a word, requires a certain phrasal complementation syntax. That's why lexicon syntax interface in Singaporean English would be to resemble to someone. Okay? And that's an innovation. Pick someone instead of pick someone up. Particles very often lost. East African English, Singaporean English, Fiji English. I picked him. Okay? Would mean I picked him up. Verb complementation, protest something instead of protest against something, and that's New Zealand English, and give something instead of give someone something. We talked about this, that the recipient in Indian English is less focused and not often verbalized. And sometimes even passive structures, a keener passive in Singaporean, the thief cannot catch by the police, which means the thief was caught by the police. Okay? Innovative structures, and all of these to varying degrees popping up in these varieties. Okay. And as I said, constructions, because of this no difference between lexicon and syntax, should be well equipped to deal with those kind of things on the lexis syntax interface. And with respect to something, sorry that these aren't in white, to something that we talked yesterday, if we think about it, it's not about the specific microconstructions that are new. Well, they are new, but these are not so visible. And it's not about the more abstract macroconstructions where the changes are observed by Edgar. But when he talks about complementation patterns, then lots of the words will be English, but only one will be sort of from the native language. It's the meso level. Okay? It's this intermediate level where we would expect changes to the constructions. Okay? Importantly, and just to sort of break this down again, construction grammar would also obviously assume that context is very important because usage is important. And we know from the history of Englishes that the most sort of the different types of varieties arise due to these 4 different types of colonies. Okay? You've got trade colonies. Very often the agents of spread are traders and missionaries, classically West African countries, Nigeria, Cameroon at the start were trading posts. So you don't get an awful lot of native speakers going there, only a few. The contact is short-lived and limited because they only go there to trade. They don't go there to talk about the weather or anything personal. They don't go there to stay. They don't run the country. Very limited contact. It is in these contexts that you're going to get pidgins, okay? Simplified language structures. Pickett, I think, called it Pidgin's second language acquisition with limited input. Okay, only for these trade purposes do people come up with pidgins, i.e. new languages that use the lexicon, words from one language, but a completely new syntax. And if we say completely new syntax, we're going to worry about this from a construction grammar point of view. How can construction grammar account for the types of syntactic phenomena that we find in pigeonization? Exploitation colonies, Kenya, for example, my favorite example, are different. Okay, these are perceived as longer colonies, so you get, again, a small hand of people. It's not large-scale settlement, not a lot of input from native speakers, but a handful of administrators that go there. And these administrators pick a handful of locals. That's the idea of the British indirect rule. They wouldn't go there and run the country. They would select a couple of people that they perceived of as bright and would say, okay, this Kenyan native can run the country on a local level. You can see the political rationale behind that, because then you would have sort of an intermediary, someone local running the show, would divert also a bit of aggression from you. But what it meant is that there was a local elite that was trained in English, right? They had specific schools for those because the administration was to be run in English, so they learnt English at school. And this kind of English was very often also described as bookish, very formal, lots of Shakespeare, lots of written text. That was the kind of learning at the time. So these post-colonial second language varieties were basically entrenched in a local elite that learnt this kind of bookish variety. Okay? And think about it, that would already imply that we've got a completely different type of input compared to short-lived trade contexts where you get pigeonization, which explains the huge differences between West African Nigerian pidgin and Kenyan English as a second language variety. Okay? But if we think about who speaks English in these situations, okay, once the Brits had gone, that is a local, the pidgins are still used as local trade languages in the post-colonial setting. We got many of the indigenous population there, then picking up English because, for the reasons I mentioned, it's introduced in the education system. It's still part of how the country is run because no local first language is available. And then we look at settlement colonies, and this is different now because in New Zealand, in Australia, you didn't just have a handful of first native speakers, you've got a whole bunch of them. Okay? Large-scale settlement. And they make up a considerable proportion of the population there. So it's settlers that go there, and the type of contact that you get is between the settlers, if they come from Scotland and the south of England or from Ireland. You're going to have coinization, that's a term by Peter Trudgill, that you choose the common form, that you go out that very specific local variants of Scottish English will get lost in favour of variants which were spoken by many of the people, which were intelligible to the majority of the settlers. And with the indigenous group, because the settlers come in such large numbers and take over the country, you first get bilingualism. Okay? It becomes important to also speak English, not just as a formal second language as in Kenya, but as a language of daily interaction, and very often shift. So Australian English, many of the native indigenous people shifted to English as a first language. So we get new first language varieties. Plantation colonies, on the other hand, that we had in the Caribbean and in the south of the United States, are again different because you do not only have the sort of indigenous people, the Native Americans didn't play a huge role in that. You had a couple of settlers and a couple of landowners, first language speakers, but you had a considerable amount of an adstrate, which is people from another place, the slaves that were transported to these areas. And if you think about this, these slaves were transported to a new situation. They came from a huge variety of language backgrounds. They also didn't have a lingua franca. They also had to get along. Okay, they had to come up with a new language, but in this case, because of this multilingual situation, we find, and because of the long-term restructuring, we find Creoles. Because unlike in the trade posts in the west of Africa, where first language speakers will come and go, okay, these people were transported for good and had to communicate for good, because we know that the descendants of the slaves are nowadays just part of the the United States population. Okay? So long-term effect, daily interaction, not just short trading, but they really had to find a way of speaking with each other in the long term. Which leads to Creoles, and we of course know Pidgins, highly simplified, short-lived contact. Creoles, more complicated because you need more domains to talk about. And more domains means you need to be able to express something linguistically more complicatedly. So let's look at this from a construction grammar point of view. So we're going to look at Pidgins and Creoles first. Who wants to read it out?
The small swine he been go for market. Should I keep going?
Yeah, just do the whole thing.
The small swine he been stay for house. The small swine he been chop soup with the fufu. The small swine he no been chop no nothing. And the small swine he been go we saute for house.
Yes. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You know the meaning of it? Mm-hmm. Exactly. So that's this little piggy, and you use the fingers to play it with the kids. And this little piggy went to the market. This little piggy stayed at home. This little piggy cooked something, and here you see chop means to eat or drink. That's a local term, and soup with the fufu, boiled balls of cassava, yams, and plantain. So don't say I'm not teaching you new stuff. And then you get this little piggy, he didn't do nothing, or he didn't cook anything. Okay. Wee wee, exactly, that's an exclamative and an interjection. Went home, wee wee, for the house. And you can play with the fingers, obviously, the wee wee thing. Okay. What's the most noticeable difference linguistically if we go beyond lexis?
How tense is represented with been instead of went, right?
Mm-hmm. So we get a simplification. That's something we expect for Pidgins. And instead of an irregular form, which is stored and, of course, entrenched in speakers that have a lot of input, if you create a Pidgin because of short-lived contact, then obviously you would go for a more regular form. So just uninflected go, and been is the tense marker. Yeah. And we see that this is sort of just fleshed out over and over again. Been go, been stay, been chop, and so on. Something that Magnus Huber had already suggested in the non-construction grammar point of view, if you think about how it is marked with respect to the constructions that we've got available, then, of course, a regular kind of past tense inflection, as in kiss, kissed, we talked about this, is a constructional template. And something like, and I'm going to show you the construction for this, been verb is just another construction. In the one case, you've got something which attaches more closely, classically a syntactic marking, as we would call it, whereas in the other way around, you've got a free form, a more analytic marking of tense, right? Just standard terminology. If we think about this, then of course the fact that Pidgins might go for a more analytic way from a construction grammar point of view is because now you've got a free form that's associated with a meaning. Okay, you've got a free form meaning association that is more conspicuous, more visible than just a suffix that is attached. Okay, so perhaps in Pidgins there is also a tendency, what we would call an analytic way of marking it, where you have one form, one meaning marker to express this grammatical category, and then you have one form, one meaning construction for the lexical verb. Okay, it's a complex construction, but the construction is simpler in that way that there's an easy one-to-one mapping between form and meaning. Okay? Okay, good. So this can be explained in a construction grammar form, but I would also say that it's an interesting challenge for construction grammar, because pigeons are obviously what people do if they don't have a common language and no lingua franca. So what do they rely on? And obviously that's what we get here, those kind of one-to-one mappings and simplifications. Okay, since pigeons also have a limited vocabulary, okay, because not a lot of exposure, you've got to find creative ways of expressing meanings that you have. And again, you know, from a construction grammar perspective, you wonder, what do people draw on? How do they come up with the constructions if they've got not the input to as a source? Circumlocution, paraphrases are sometimes used to express it, that in other varieties would be expressed by single words. Okay. And just as a footnote, the spelling here is sort of roughly phonetic, as in most Pidgin and Creoles. Some items have a fortification of initial f to p. That might help you to identify what word they are making reference to, and sometimes it's clipped off. But let's have a look at those. Just a second. Okay. And this is going to be interesting because we don't speak the Pidgin. Okay? But if we can process what they mean, then it means it must draw into a general cognitive principle that allows us to pass these constructions. Okay? So, gras belong face. Yes. Gras belong head. Gras belong eye. Yes. Water belong skin. Water. And if you think about it, water, you know, if you've got, sweat, if you've got an alveolar, if you've got a tap in American English, it's actually pretty similar. Finger belong leg, and p and f. If you try Finger belong leg, toe. And that's really difficult because Pella is such an all-purpose name, but Pella belong up bottle. Fella belong up bottle. It's a bottle opener. Up bottle. Okay. If you think about it, I mean, for most, I mean, the Pella belong up bottle, that's difficult, okay? But for all the other ones, despite the fact that we don't speak the Pidgin, we were able to sort it out, okay? There must be something general cognitively going on here, which is why these people in Pidgins, when they lack a specific form meaning correspondence, go for a paraphrase construction like this. And if we think about it, what's the relationship between the first couple? I mean, the construction itself, there's something like X belong Y, okay? And that's a standard construction that they use. But what's the relationship between X and Y? Why did we call it gras for beard? Which general cognitive principle is at work here? The beard hair is like the grass on the field? Metaphor. Okay. Lake of Turner would say metaphors we live by, you know, is a very important cognitive device with which we as humans conceptualize of the world, and conceptualize in particular once you've got a full-fledged language of more complex relationships. Let's just say you've got a concept that sort of isn't entrenched in a specific construction. If you want to express that a certain prime minister in his attempt of doing something is very reckless and perhaps not so good, then you could say he's the George Bush of British Parliament. Okay? That would express a concept that isn't lexicalized, but we would understand it because we know how metaphors work. Okay? There is a perceived similarity between George W. Bush and this guy, and what is George W. Bush known for with respect to his politics, and you transfer this to the other person. Okay? This is something that we also do in first languages, but because we've already got so many learnt constructions for things like toe and beard and so on, we don't need it for those kind of concepts. But if you see sort of what do people rely on if they don't have that many entrenched constructions, then metaphor is going to play a huge role. Also, you get sort of very superordinate categories or bigger elements, and there meronymy plays a role, right? Because the beard is attached to the face, and your hair is attached to the head, that kind of thing. So meronymy is another very basic conceptual structure, also plays a role. So that's why I think, and there is really not, I don't know, Alex, do you know of any constructional analysis of Pidgins and Creoles? No, I've never seen it. There is little work in cognitive linguistics. There is so much more to be done on that. Okay? But from everything we said before, since input can't play such a huge role, and Alex and I have been talking a lot about input, okay? In these situations, in Pidgins and Creoles, with limited context where people got to make up what they do, those general cognitive domain principles and those general cognitive principles like metaphor metonymy should play a huge role in how the linguistic structure emerges, okay? Because we don't believe in a universal grammar. That would be another option. That you've got something innate, and that would be something that people can draw on, but that's clearly not the case. Let's now think about Creoles, which have a more complex grammatical system. Since they are used as first languages, remember the ad straight situation in slavery on the plantations. There it's not just short-lived context, but definitely longer. And now we get something where, again, a more complex system evolves, but perhaps also a more analytic one is preferred. So we look at Jamaican Creole. That's been around for quite some time. And obviously, since you've got to talk about more elements, you also need more complexity in the grammatical system. That's also why Creoles are very often perceived of as more complex than Pidgins. If you've got Jamaican Creole, mi run, mi benron, mi ron, mi benaron, and these compare with British American English, I ran, I had run, I'm running, I was running. Okay. If you do a contrastive analysis of these, which grammatical markers do you identify first of all? Let's start with that way, and then we can think about them from a construction grammar perspective.
Tense again with through the use of ben, bing.
Mm-hmm. Ben is definitely a tense marker. What kind of a tense marker? What does it do if we describe its meaning?
Past. Indicates past.
Yes. There's an added complexity that we're going to talk about in a second. But I mean, the first one is already I ran, and ben run is I had run.
Like past perfect.
Yes. Definitely past before. That's what is captured by this. Because we're going to see if you've got something like me love, that would be I love, which we conceive of as happening now. And me ben love, that means I loved. Okay? So it's really just a marker that says before this time. It goes just one step back. What about the a?
Present continuous.
Yes, so we get an aspectual distinction now. Okay? Ongoing versus conceived of as completed. And you can combine the two, benaron, then you obviously get past ongoing. Okay? You can already see that this system is, of course, more complex than the Pidgins, and we said domains, extension of domains are important here. You need to talk about more stuff that has happened before. But still, there is a tendency towards free marking, okay? Towards one to one, that's the one I was looking for, one-to-one mappings of form and meaning. So we've got a one-to-one form meaning mapping where we say, okay, Ben gives you past before, R gives you ongoing, and this is past before ongoing with running. I was running. In a straightforward kind of way. Okay. So we see, I mean, and that's not something that construction grammarians have said, but something that we've seen before. There is simplification in Pidgins. Okay. And if we think about what is simplified, then there is an analytic past tense construction, been as a marker, and V, that will be what the construction is like. Formal level, phonology been, then a slot, and this slot is just the base verb. Been go, been sleep, been chop. And that's associated with past tense of this, chopped, went, and so on, in standard English, just so that we translate it. Well, tense is a pretty basic category that many languages, though some people would say not all languages exhibit. We see the role of metaphor. As you rightly said, I mean, the structure we can easily describe of this belong structure is A belong B. Okay? But of course, this is motivated by this general tendency for metaphor. So the role between A and B is not random, but we assume that A is habitually part of, close to, onto, similar to B. And that's, of course, motivated by metaphor. In Creoles, we get more complex grammatical constructions, but there's still, I mean, all of this can also be captured by other theories, but construction grammar can also straightforwardly put them into full meaning pairings. And we can see that a and the verbal base now has the meaning progressive, and the bin, and this is tense before. The one complexity, and that is something that we very often get in the conceptualizations of events in many languages, is the one between activities and states. Okay? If you use the present tense for an activity, then because you as the speaker are talking about it, very often it will be perceived as already having happened. So I run, because you're not running right now, is already transferred to I ran in many of these languages. Because in the speaker-hero situation, it's clear you're not running right now. So in this activity, which has to be sort of temporarily bound, is put to the past. That's why we had I run in this example. Stative verbs, on the other hand, which do not necessarily have to be bounded semantically, they get interpreted in normally as present now. Okay, so the default is sort of non-stative activities as being in the past, and statives as being present now. Okay, that's just got something to do with this, how we semantically interpret statives and non-statives. So again, something that we can cognitively explain, but something that complexifies, if that is a word, makes it more complicated, this specific system. If we now move on to second language varieties, where we see the evolution across these 5 stages, then what Edgar describes in his dynamic model is the fact that if you've got a variety and the settlers first come, or a colony is newly opened, was it that bad? Yeah, okay, no problem. No, I'm kidding. That in the foundation phase, where you get the first linguistic effect, so that is something that many studies have shown and that Edgar sort of just summarizes, you get toponymic borrowings, place names, names for areas, you know, because those are the kind of things, if you've got limited contact with people, you go somewhere, you will know that, oh, the island is called Cius. Okay? You might not speak any Spanish, but you know, okay, if I go there, that's Cius. That's the kind of landmark that people learn. Very limited. From a construction grammar point of view, if we look at what is borrowed here, okay, then in this very sort of simple context situation, you get atomic substantive constructions. No slots, no mesoconstructions, obviously, and very specific things with a very high frequency, because if you are in an area, you know, moving around in the location is going to be salient and frequent, so those get borrowed. That's the first stage. Exonormative stabilization, you know, the British plus X identity, they've already stayed a bit, there is a bit more contact between indigenous and settlers. You get things which, again, are sort of local. So now cultural terms, tipi, raccoon, fauna, flora. Now you also talk with the people about the kind of animals that you hunt and so on. And again, we get atomic substantive constructions which have a high frequency. Okay? And these are again just borrowed as constructions, and they're easily incorporated because they're 4 meaning pairings, you take them as a whole and you use them in your constructicum. This is nativization, and that's where Edgar says innovations at the Lexis syntax climb. Okay? And this is what I said, this got me interested in the dynamic model. So this is something that is complex, and it's substantive and partly schematic innovations at the mesoconstructional level. Okay? This intermediate level. They don't come up from the word go with a completely new passive rule, okay, or with a completely new rule for complementation of all verbs. But it's specific verbs that sort of fill a slot, like protest, okay, and then you don't have protest against something, but just protest. It's a minor tweak, but it's already at a mesoconstruction level because the subject and the object slot, the protester and what they protest against, that's open. And you only slightly tweak this to get a new mesoconstruction. It's creative because you can fill in lots of subjects and objects, but it's not like a massive new restructuring of all prepositional verbs, okay? That wouldn't make sense from a usage-based perspective because input-wise you wouldn't step from one thing to another by jumping over it. Then, during endonormative stabilization, homogeneity, there we should get, perhaps at the macro-constructional level, but also at the meso-constructional level, a homogeneity. That's the kind of colonization. We should get rid of also features that differ between the various settlers. They should agree subconsciously on which construction they want to go. If they had, for example, an irregular way or a non-standard way of forming past tense with to be, I were ill, instead of I was ill. There are certain varieties that have got this. If the majority of speakers have I was ill, they would all sort of focus on the common variant, and more less frequent ones would sort of lose out, and you get a very homogeneous New Australian or New Zealand type of variety, and you can't so easily say the settlers used to be Irish, Scottish, or wherever they came from, because now you've got this new thing. And the final thing is group-specific lects, social linguistics, group-specific constructions, what we had at the start, the cognitive social linguistic bit, in a Lebovian kind of sense. Then, after a certain time, when they are stabilized politically, historically, and new identities can form, which are not based on the former ethnic, settler, indigenous kind of dichotomy, but on new class-based, situation-based, group-based, regional variation, that kind of thing, then we get exactly that kind of cognitive social linguistic variation. So, structural innovations during nativization, when we first see new things which are different in a variety, which go beyond borrowings of atomic items. So place names or animal names, those are easy. Lots of languages have done that. English has done that through centuries. But the structural innovations happen at this meso level. For that, of course, you need a sufficient number of type frequency. You need many different tokens to give you a new kind of schema. And it requires considerable settler indigenous contact for a certain verb to be used. But it's still important that we see that the causes of certain structures are going to be various. Okay? For the indigenous people, there is still the possibility they've got a fully fledged constructicon, their first language. And certain structures and conceptualizations, those will play a role. Remember what I said about Indian English there. It said that the recipient, for example, in a giving event is not encoded linguistically. Okay? That would be an interference that can come from their structural setup. We've got L2 learning strategies, simplification, generalization, cognitive principles, which we also assume are at work in pigeonization and general languages in general, iconicity and metaphor, metonymy, processing constraints, everything we've talked about before. These things are also going to play a role. Okay. So, what I'm now going to talk about is one specific type of construction, which I think, even in standard English, straddles the line between lexical and syntax. It's a bit of an idiomatic structure. It's got idiosyncrasies. And this was my first pilot study where I thought, okay, I could look at that and ask myself, do the predictions that I have, that it's innovations at the meso-constructional level that we find at stage 3 and at these specific new varieties. Comparative correlatives, the more complex the talk, the longer the talk, the more the merrier, work in that way. You've got the, introducing two clauses. The construction that you have, if we just sort of focus on the word level and the more syntax level, is a the, followed by a comparative phrase, which can be more complex or louder, and then perhaps followed by a clause, because you can also delete it, and the same mirrored in the second one. And the meaning is always something like cause, effect, protasis, apodosis. The first one gives you an independent variable, so the more you eat, if you do this, more, cause, effect is the fatter you're going to get, effect, more. In contrast to ordinary kind of if clauses, where you usually have cause and effect on a non-scalar base, so you do this, you get that. Okay? These have got the added comparative value, which give you a scale. So the more and more and more and more, the more and more and more, or the less and the less. Okay? So on top of a relationship of cause-effect, there's also this scale thing. And it's assumed that the more you go on one scale, the more it's going to affect the scale of the second one. Okay. Now these are clearly, I mean, even the most abstract ones here, are at least sort of in between the lexicon syntax interface, okay? Because the slot is filled, and there are many lexicalizations like the more the merrier. These are idioms that are stored, and everyone would assume they have to be stored, and you've got the creative ones that can be filled with the slots as we've specified them here and here. Okay. Today I focus on several things which I think, and that might have got something to do with the input that many of these varieties received, because these factors have been at play at least since the Middle English period. Deletion phenomena, so when can you leave out things like the topic or the verb, because this can also be extended to the more complex the topic is, the longer the talk is, okay? Which, as we're going to see, is specific to this construction. And I'm looking at specific fillers, at micro constructions, or at least at substantive realizations of this comparative slot, and I ask myself, are these two related? And how much do specific varieties depend on them? The most schematic macro construction that we can give for this type of element is, as I said, this one, a clause, and the relationship one is of independent variable to dependent variable. And it's got certain interesting variationist approaches, so there's also synchronic variation there, which is interesting from a syntactic point of view, even for standard Englishes. Because if you think about this, you get the higher the demand is, the higher the price is, or the higher the demand, the higher the price is, or the higher the demand is, the higher the price, or the higher the demand, the higher the price. Okay. This is interesting because if you think about B deletion in standard American and British English, in, for example, declarative clauses, if you say the price is high, then you cannot say the price high. Okay? African American vernacular English, you've got B deletion in these contexts, but not in standard British English or standard American English. So this is a deletion process that is specific to this construction. From a construction grammar point of view, that's not a problem, because it's also a construction, not only because its form is sort of special, you've got the followed by a comparative phrase, the bigger, the higher. Okay? And normally the, in other instances, is an article, the man, so it's followed by a noun. But in this construction, formally, it's followed by a comparative adjective. So it's, and historically it used to be, it comes from a different source in Old English. But the point is, the form is differently used in these two constructions. Okay? So you can't generalize from the normal use of the, which is followed by a noun, to this construction. So it's special, and we need to store this, as we said. So a special formal property, and on the meaning level it's also special because this semantic relationship between the first and the second clause, again, is something that you only get in comparative correlatives. Okay? So form and meaning both have parts which are special and which mean that speakers have to learn this construction. On top of that, for this special construction, we've got a special deletion process, which is only at work for that and not for other constructions. And even more, you can even truncate it further, even for elements which are not lexicalized idioms like the more the merrier, where you just have comparative and comparative in the two clauses. But the higher a product's price is, the less attractive it is, or the higher the less attractive it is, the higher a product's price is, the less attractive, the higher the less attractive. Okay. So I looked at the International Corpus of English as well as the Brown Corpora. But for this study, I'm just going to compare what we found out for the different varieties of English. As I said, the 1 million corpora are a bit limited, but at least they're spoken and written, and currently they're probably our best attempt at, if you want to do contrastive studies on World Englishes. Look for these structures, the more, the less, the worse, and the asterisk followed by ER, which obviously gives you many false positives like the painter, the writer, and you've got to discard them. Okay. And then I classified the corpora that I had for British English, Canadian English, Irish, New Zealand, Jamaican, Singapore, Hong Kong, Philippines, India, Nigeria, Kenya, and Tanzania, the classic kind of ICE corpora. And I classified these according to the dynamic model because British, Canadian, Irish, and New Zealand English are put under differentiation, stage 5. Jamaican and Singaporean English are under 4, though probably on the move. And those are all in the stage 3. Okay, nativization stage. Politically, historically, identity formation-wise, and if you look at the linguistic effects that they have. Okay, so that's a classification that is independent of me. That's something that people, and in particular Edgar working on the dynamic model, have come up with. Okay. And so I would assume that, of course, especially for these, we should find mesoconstructional innovations. That's where the action should be at. Whereas for these, we should see a wider use of more abstract templates. Okay. But on top of that, and I've said this for all of the studies, still we expect general cognitive processes and general effects to surface in all of the varieties. Let's look at deletion and the specific types of phrases. That's just the stats. I used a method by Stefan Gries. We're not going to talk about it unless you want to talk about it later. Anyone interested? Okay. It's hierarchical configural analysis, basically chi-squares for each cells, but corrected for multiple tests, if you're into stats. So then I plotted, because I always find that's most intuitive. So I look here at the first clause, and I ask myself if there is B deletion, the higher the price instead of the higher the price is. Yeah, okay. The higher the price instead of the higher the price, that's that column. Then you've got a column where B is retained, so the higher the price is. You get full clauses without a B, where you can't delete it anyway. That's why they get a separate column. So the more you eat, you can't just say the more you, or the more the man eats, the more the man doesn't work. These are obviously full. And in the second, the last column, those are the truncated ones, like the more the merrier, or the more attractive, the higher the more attractive. Okay? Where only the comparative phrase is left, but you've deleted subject and verb and all complements. We can already see full clauses account for the majority of it. If you look on the x-axis, that's the longest line. But what you also see, we've got this very same kind of factors in the second clause, okay, where the B is deleted. The higher the price is, the fatter you get, or the fatter. And now the interesting way of these mosaic plots is you can look at the biggest chunks, okay? Because these are going to give you association. So the biggest chunk, if C1 is a full clause, is this here. And that's also full clause here. So we get a parallel kind of pattern. If the first clause has no B and is full, the second one is also full and B. If the first clause has B deletion, what's the biggest chunk? In terms also of color, if you can't read it, but what's the biggest square? The black one. And if I look here, that's B deletion. Okay? So if you get B deletion in the first one, the biggest chunk is B deletion in the second one. If you've got B retained in the second one, the biggest one is gray, and gray is B retained. Okay? So if you've got a form of to be, then across clauses, and I mean for any kind of theory that builds clauses bottom up and one clause doesn't care about the other one, that's complicated, right? But if you've got a constructional template that has the whole thing, then you can more easily describe a constraint that says if something happens in the first one, it also needs to happen in the second one. So we see this kind of parallelism. And in the last one, if it's truncated, you know, the biggest chunk is again truncation. And the stats, what the stats does is it takes into account that perhaps full clauses are way more frequent than the others. Okay? But taking into account how frequent these are, and how frequent they are in the first clause and in the second one, even then, is there common occurrence that it's full in the first and full in the second one, significantly, this happens more often than expected by chance. Even taking into account that there's lots of fulls, that's why we expect them in the first, and lots of fulls in the second one. So just by chance, you expect many full types. But there's even more than expected, and that's statistically significant. And also for truncation, deletion, and retention. Okay? So for all of the Englishes, if you group them together, you get the same kind of pattern. Deletion in the first, deletion in the second, full clause in the first, full in the second. So you get templates which basically sort of have this in parallel. The reason for this, why many of the varieties might have it, this is something that you see sort of already going on with Middle English data. Okay, so in Old English the construction didn't quite exist. There was a change. You only had a related one. Then it comes into being during the late Old English period. We've got textual evidence then for Middle English. And then during the Middle English period, you already get this deletion process, okay? Which I'm just going to jump back. Also, it's got something to do with how this construction is entrenched in English, and there are certain cognitive principles behind that. Because if you think about it, there are two things going on between the clauses. The one thing is that semantically they're identical clause internally. Okay? Both of them describe a scale of doing something and doing it more for the first and the second. So semantically they're parallel. At the same time, the relationship between the two clauses is asymmetric, because one is cause and the other is effect. And typologically, if you look at what languages do, then you've got two options. Some languages seem to focus iconically more on the asymmetric relationship, so they make clear what the cause and what the effect clause is. In German, for example, the effect clause has verb second, it's a main clause, and it has a different type of introductory word, umso, desto. And in the first one, you've got je, a different form. In English, it's the. They're marked identically. Of course, in English, you also had, during the Middle English period, the tendency towards subject-verb-object order, so word order is going to be the same. There was an independent effect. Also, the reduction of the introductory word the to the contributed to that. But it seems that if English, already very early on, tended towards a parallel structure, so that the first and second clause look alike, both introduced by the, both with the same kind of word order, both with the same kind of deletion strategy. Okay? B is there in the first, B is there in the second. B isn't there in the first, you don't get it in the second. Truncated, truncated. Okay? So English moves towards this parallelism, which is, of course, an expression of the parallel semantic computation of the two. In contrast to this, German, where you have a greater difference, this focuses more on the asymmetric cause-effect interpretation. So, it is not surprising that across all varieties of English, because this starts very early in the Middle English period, because of independent factors, that the two clauses become more alike, that this expression, also of the deletion and the truncation, is found in all of the varieties. There is still variety-specific kind of instances that Singaporean, for example, has certain truncation patterns which are preferred on top of this general effect. That takes into account how many Singaporean tokens you have, and even for them it's slightly more specific, even more strongly favored. Yeah, okay. So from a usage-based perspective, these would be stored, but that's not so interesting. I mean, I'm always inclined to think that for second language varieties, we see a greater influence of processing factors, as I said. But here, you know, of course, you can argue that it's an expression of the iconic relationship between first and second clause. Their computation is alike. The first clause is computed like the same one. But it's a bit of a stretch to say that this particular pattern could also sort of fit my, my narrative. Okay. So again, general specific principles, and also taking into account the input that all of these varieties had in the 18th and 19th century. This is something which we can still attribute to input, but is there a way of thinking about the reliance on mesoconstructions? Okay? And the way I thought about this is to look at specific filler constructions. To look at the specific comparative phrase that is used here, whether you say bigger, easier, fatter, more, the more you eat, the more you like it, that kind of thing, or the more apples you eat, the healthier you're going to get. You can look at all of these. These are obviously substantive elements, comparative elements. And my hunch was that if you are a nativization variety, you should use more of these entrenched, the more, or the bigger the better. Still filling the slots behind, so the bigger you are, the better you're going to perform. But that you keep those slots for the comparative phrases fixed. Okay? So instead of having a more abstract macro construction, the comparative phrase clause, the comparative phrase clause, you would rely more on mesoconstructions, which are the more subject clause, the more subject clause. Fewer slots, more of a mesoconstruction. Okay? So, the results that we get, again, statistically tested so that we take into account more, for example, is going to occur very often in the first clause and it's going to appear very often in the second one because it's obviously used for comparison. Okay. And my idea was, if the statistics now identify pairs for a specific variety, like the more, the bigger, the better, the nicer, the more expensive, whatever a variety might entrench. If you get many of these mesoconstructions, that's more closer to the nativization stage. Okay? You rely more on mesoconstructions, you're not quite as independent. You rely more on macroconstructions, then that means you need less of these specific, the more, the bigger, the better. And there shouldn't be as many significant pairs, because you can rely on a more abstract schema. Okay? Because innovation should be at the meso level. Okay. So, for British English, 39 tokens. You get the bigger, the more adverb, the more noun, the more, but only one instance. Okay, and I discarded these, despite the fact that the sets are sort of indicating it being significant, but really if you've only got one token, then yes, it's surprising that it's only those two, that kind of thing. So you've got to discard those. If you look at Jamaican English, stage 4, 31 tokens, you already get more, and you get already this reliance more adjective greater, which comes up 7 times, the first word and the second one, and this, the more adjective, the greater, comes up 3 times, and that's now significant. Okay? Those two are not generated independently, but that's one of those, the more adjective clause, the greater clause, that would be a pattern that seems to be entrenched for Jamaican English. And for Philippines English, stage 3, you get already more, so the higher the lower comes up as significant, and the more and the more. And more noun, so the more apples, the more fruit, or something like that. So, and this is just a rough first guide, and as I said, it's a hunch, and we need much more sort of analysis on that. And perhaps comparative correlatives, because these were already sort of pretty stabilized by the time all of these varieties were formed. On the best test case, but they were the ones I had at my disposal. You can see that British English, a stage 5 variety, has many different filler pairs, many different lexicalizations, and that seems to rely more on a macro construction. Okay? Because the individual exemplars, high type frequency, many different, so you can draw on the more abstract, more meso or even macro construction. In stage 4 varieties, you've got many different fillers, but you've also got a highly productive macro construction, but there is like one prototypical meso construction or two. So you see that reliance more again on these specific meso constructions. And for stage 3, what I assumed is many more meso constructions, because those should be more important for those varieties, because the input, they don't generalize to the macro construction. And so many more of these intermediate substantive schematic construction should play a role. Okay. This is, I looked at the number of hapaxes, non-hapaxes compared to hapaxes, the percentage, basically just to see sort of what's the percentage of variation in terms of the reliance on specific patterns. And this is a Klein. And the lower the number, that's why I've got the hapaxes down there, in a percentage, the lower the number means that you don't have many elements that occur twice, 3 times, 4 times, things which would be mesoconstructional in nature. So the higher this number is, the more it means that you've got non-hapaxes, the more you've got significant pairs which you rely on in terms of the more, the sooner the better, and so on. And it's a Klein, it's not brilliant, and we see that there is a complexity here. But for British and New Zealand English, we see that. There's a high type frequency, many different types, but not many tokens that occur more than once, which gives you a productive pattern, more of a macro construction. For our stage 3 varieties, like Indian English and Kenyan English, you get a percentage of 31, 20%, a higher number. And in between would be stage 4 varieties like Singaporean and Jamaican Jamaican English. So this general tendency would sort of support the fact that you say, okay, the more stage 3 of a variety you are, the more mesoconstructions you use. And if you're a stage 5 variety, you rely more on the more abstract template because you can create many new instances. But there is obviously the fact that these in between sort of, they're problematic, the Canadian and Irish English ones. But so generally, I would argue that the further advanced a variety according to the dynamic model is, the fewer mesoconstructions it needs, because more input, more use, more reliance on macro constructions. But we've got Canadian and Irish English, and we need to look a bit more at how these sort of flesh out. If you look at Irish English, had 43 tokens that I looked at of my construction, and there were 4 significant filler pairs, 4 mesoconstructions that came out as significant. So the sooner the better, the more adjective, the more noun, the more noun, and the more. Many, obviously, and I separated the adverbial, the more you eat, from those which are in a kind of determinative position to noun or comparative adjectives. So yes, we see that there are more mesoconstructions, but at least they're sort of evenly spread out amongst different types of mesoconstructions. So maybe this is one at an intermediate stage. That was my tentative conclusion, that in order to get to a macro construction, you obviously need many different mesoconstructions. And this stage 4 variety, this stage 5 variety is still exhibiting that you get many different mesoconstructions at the level at which allow you then to generalize. Whereas for many of the level 3 varieties, we've only had sort of a greater number, but with a smaller frequency of mesoconstructions. On the other hand, Canadian English, 28 tokens, there was really one prototype, the more, and many different other tokens. So there we seem to have a case of an abstract construction that is deeply entrenched, because you get many tokens that are not sort of significantly associated, plus one prototype. So not a clear-cut result. Not at all. I'd be lying if I said that completely supports what I was saying. So the best I can say about the study is that I at least tried to argue for a hypothesis that mesoconstruction should be where it's at from a constructional point of view, and I illustrated what that means for this specific construction, and a certain tendency is shown in the data, but it's not clear-cut. Okay? Many possible reasons, but something to be wary about. I might be completely wrong about all of this. Okay? Potentially. But even then, I would argue that the constructional approach to the New English and the dynamic model is valid. Okay? The notion that, of course, first toponymic borrowings, atomic substantive constructions, and then fauna, flora, atomic constructions, that's easily explained, and any kind of theory can deal with those lexical borrowings. And if something new should happen, then from a construction grammar perspective, it should be the meso level, right? Because we don't have rules. We've got constructions which generalize from micro to meso to macro level, despite the fact that Elizabeth might not like the term, but from the usage-based perspective, we see that you make small-scale generalizations first based on similar tokens, and only then do you go to a large-scale generalization. Okay. And if you do a qualitative analysis, if we keep that in mind, then there are instances where we get proper innovations, because so far I was relying on frequency, and I argued that these stage 3 varieties would rely more on mesoconstructions, but those mesoconstructions wouldn't be unpassable by native speakers. They could still generate them, so the more, if you've got that as a template, the more you eat, the fatter you get. That could be passed by someone who's only got who relies more on macro constructions, okay, by a British English speaker. But my line of argument was that frequency-wise, mesoconstructions should still come out as more important in the stage 3 varieties. But real innovation is when structures are new. And this is what you get. So for something like Kenya, you get things like, as your mother expressed the milk, the more milk is made. As you're trying to suppress him, the more the urge and the demand for freedom. As the hours are reduced, the less the salary will be. Okay? It's exactly the construction we are talking about. Cause, effect, C1, C2. But what this construction does, and it would be interesting to look more, but I haven't really found the data there, on comparative correlatives in the input languages of Kenya, Kikuyu or other types of Bantu languages. But what happens here is obviously that now, despite the fact that Standard English doesn't have it, you distinguish cause from effect again. Okay? Just like German, which makes it clear what the independent variable and what the dependent variable is, because one is a main clause and the other is a subordinate. Now you use a different introductory word, as and the. And in the data, you really only get as in the first one and the in the second one. It's obviously clear why you get as, because as you've got those proportional comparatives. As you sow, so shall you reap. As, again, cause and effect. But not normally in Standard English in the kind of comparative kind of way. You can have as you eat more, so you will get fatter, and then you would have a template which is similar to the more you eat, the fatter you get. But normally as is not comparative. Okay? Whereas the comparative correlatives always have this scale. The more you go in this scale, the more you're going to go on the other scale. So it's clear why as should enter into this construction. Why it's eligible to move into this, because they are semantically related. You're going to have an analogy, and in terms of priming, for meaning correspondences, they should also be more closely tied together in the constructicon. So we can backtrack why as should be used, and we can also see the function of it. It sort of reverses a tendency in Standard Englishes, which focus more on the semantic similarity of the two clauses, and refocuses again on the different asymmetric relationship of cause and effect. Okay. So as I said, from my point of view, construction grammar is an adequate framework for the dynamic model, for the evolution of new Englishes. And hopefully I was able to show how that works for Pidgins and Creoles, and also for the evolution of second language varieties. Innovations at the Lexis syntax interface, for me, means greater use of mesoconstruction. That can mean frequency, as I tried to do it in the filler-filler associations, the more the more. But it should also mean structural proper innovations, like the as, the more, that you get in Kenyan English. And of course, I said this before, cognitive general domain cognitive principles like the parallel deletion and the parallel semantic computation that was already in place before these were brought to the colonies. So it's not surprising that we see those effects still being perpetuated. Okay? Despite the fact that they're only there in this construction, B deletion doesn't work in declarative clauses, okay? Which is interesting that it's sort of limited to this level. Okay. Breathe in, breathe out. So far, so good.